Thank you, Bryce, for the introduction. I'd like to thank Geshe Hautola and Dr. Bryce Johnson for coordinating this wonderful conference and giving an opportunity to say a few words in this most wonderful conference. So far, the conference has been most enlightening. The presentation from Dr. Grayson this morning and also yesterday from Chris and others, are clear kind of presentations that show that how scientific community is, thinking outside of the box. And I think this is wonderful as we continue these dialogues between the science and the contemplatives, or the contemplative traditions. What I want to say is a little bit about consciousness, since it is part of the title for this conference. And my title was that one need to be conscious to have a consciousness. Now, so far, the consciousness, as we have heard, it obviously has kind of dealt with a broad sense of consciousness. What I want to talk about is a very specific way the consciousness is understood in the neuroscience today, in the mainstream neuroscience today. And as we hold these dialogues, I think it's very important for us to have a clearer sense of what is meant by the term, specific term that we use when we engage two disciplines, Buddhism and neuroscience. So in the neuroscience, I think that the general definition, if you will, for consciousness is more like a sense of self in the act of knowing. So it's not a general mind or the namshe, for example, in Tibetan, which refers to vijnana in Sanskrit, which is basically referred to a primary state of mind, as the definition for mental, as Ken Rinpoche yesterday provided, that it is something that is luminous and knowing. In other words, the mind in general, and that includes all the cognitive and the affective or the emotional states. It's characterized as having its nature as clear or luminous, as it reflects the objects that it engages with. But its function is cognizance, or to know, to engage. So in that sense, that definition covers the entire kind of spectrum of what is known as mind and mental factors, or the entire experiential world. But when it comes to namshe, which is usually translated as consciousness in English nowadays, in most of the Buddhist literature, that's a very specific kind of part of the mind. And if you look at the Tibetan psychology, there's primary mind and the secondary mind, sometimes known as mind and mental factors. The mind refers to that very kind of the basic nature of that aspect of the mind. In other words, the namshe, or that primary conscious primary mind, if you will, of course, it expresses through all modalities, through the visual, kind of the visual perceptions, the auditory perceptions, tactile and mental, all six states of the, on all six mediums. But the distinction is that namshe is that primary state of the mind, and in other words, the vijnana, or the namshe, which is translated as the consciousness in the Buddhist world, its primary function is to simply to engage the object as a whole, and the secondary mental states, otherwise known as mental factors, are about specifics that relates to specific aspects of the object, or function. So in that sense, they are, in a way, kind of completely interwoven. In fact, they are of one entity, but they are different from their functional, or from the kind of functional perspective. So I think that is important. Now, engaging in this kind of dialogues, I think it's also important for us to keep in mind that the modern science and the Buddhist tradition, they do come from very different basic paradigms. The fundamental paradigms are completely different when it comes to the nature of the mind, or the life, if you will. As the modern science sees that the life emerged accidentally, if you will, when the certain physical conditions were sufficient to give rise to such life, and which supports a certain kind of entity that registers information, and that's the way that the mainstream science looks at the kind of origins, if you will, of the mind, at least on this earth, mind as we know. Buddhism, on the other hand, as the Venerable Khyentse Rinpoche yesterday pointed out, that the mind is not an emergent property of the certain physical entities, but rather mind requires a mind that precedes a certain instance of the mind as its substantial cause. So, this idea, or this understanding of how mind comes to being is dependent on two-pronged, or the two aspects of its conditions, or the causes. One is what is known as substantial cause, that has to be mind, and the contributing cause. And the contributing cause can be physical properties. And in that sense, that we can certainly, it can certainly resonate with Dr. Grayson was hinting today, that the brain may not be the kind of the efficient cause of the mind. In other words, the brain may not be the cause that itself has to give rise to the consciousness, but it certainly contributes to the various aspects of the mind. So that fundamental kind of the paradigm, differences in paradigm, I think we have to keep in mind. But that difference need not hinder us in coming together and addressing kind of exploring the different aspects of the mind and functions of the mind, so that we can utilize different states of the mind in enriching of our life, whether personal health or the communal or the social well-being. So that's one thing that we have to keep in mind. Now, with such fundamental kind of the paradigms of the origins of the mind, I like to use kind of the mind in the broader sense, because the consciousness, again, because when we talk about the consciousness, from the neuroscientific perspective, it's a very, very specific state of the mind. That's apparently, according to the mainstream neuroscience, has evolved quite recently in the evolution because it has to have a sense of self and sense of knowing. So how do we, understand this consciousness, that from the neuroscientific perspective? Obviously, that we can one way we can neuroscience looks at its evolutionary kind of origins, but also it also looks at how to explanatory kind of the way to explain what the nature of the consciousness is. So as it is known that in the neuroscientific field that there are two problems, the hard problem and the easy problem. The easy problem, as they say, which is still a daunting task, but the easy problem, according to neuroscientists, about understanding consciousness has to do with understanding the very specific neural kind of activities of the neural circuits, neural anatomy, neural function, and the specific way that how the neural correlates produce consciousness. And that's one way to look at is that sort of the hardwire that apparently produces consciousness. That, from neuroscientific point of view, is considered somewhat easier. That tremendous advances have been made, but still a long way to go to understand. But the real hard problem of explaining consciousness has to do with this qualia. That has the qualia has to sense this sense of knowing. That if I'm looking at this bottle, you could have the most kind of the sophisticated computer with a camera that takes the images of the computer and analyzes everything, that what it is made of and everything about the physical nature of this water bottle and the water molecules and everything. But still, such a computer would not have a sense of existing. The computer doesn't know that it exists, or it is perceiving it or analyzing it. The special edition of the Time magazine, the latest Time magazine, has this kind of one of the main articles on consciousness, and it comes with that the best computer in the world can analyze a tremendous amount of data, but it would not know that it exists, but we do. So the hard problem has to do with how we explain this knowing as we are engaged in act of knowing, and that part is what the neuroscientists themselves have until apparently very recently kind of stayed away, because it's something that it's very hard to study. And among others, one of the scientists that I have read, Antonio Damasio, is really one of the two actually I know. The other is Joseph Ledoux. Both of them have attempted to give a very kind of detailed explanation of how the consciousness that came to being, or how to understand that. So in the Damasio's model, it presents that in the evolutionary sense, from the singlest organism, like even unicell, with one cell organism that has no nervous system to speak. There is no nervous system in this, but nonetheless is equipped with certain devices to detect or register information, and thus to approach the information that would maximize its survival, and to retrieve from the information that will minimize its survival. That kind of the function is there, even the most kind of basic organism. What it tells is that organisms are most importantly about survival. So the neuroscientific explanation is that as organisms become more complex, then the more complex behavior, more complex mental activities developed, and then finally, as you can see in this tree of life, when then you have this brain stem and what may be called the limbic system, the nuclei in the brain, like the thalamus and the amygdala and so forth and so on, and then you have the more evolved cortex like the frontal cortex and so forth and so on. The mental activities become more complex. So somewhere there, according to Damasio, it has to do with the emotions also, because it's about survival. Emotions are understood some kind of signals that our organism is able to produce in the presence of certain stimuli, that have to do with the regulation of the system in order to protect oneself. So there, that he talks about there's a level, a point, up to a certain point, the organism in this evolution do act, with which from our perspective would be like that, as we do, that if there is a danger, we know that would be dangerous and then avoid or so forth. But in a sense, they don't have that self-consciousness. They don't have this self-awareness. But it's somewhat kind of instinctual. But he calls that there is some kind of self, proto-self, but there is no awareness of the self. And then eventually, as emotions are registered in higher brains, then they are what he calls, they are feelings. And the feelings, then when we becomes first aware of the feelings, are about the changes in the internal milieu, or the internal kind of the organs and the internal biochemical profile and so forth. Then there is a sense that these changes are the emotions that one is feeling are about the changes in one's system, and therefore there is a sense of kind of the self, what he calls the core self, that emerges a sense of core self. And then as it evolves, there is more complex nature of the self, what he calls the autobiographical self. So that is what in the neuroscience, when you talk about the consciousness, Buddhism does not see that way. So that's why my topic was that you have to be conscious to have consciousness. From the Buddhist point of view, certainly you don't have to be conscious to have consciousness, because in deep sleep, according to the neuroscience, from this perspective, one has no consciousness because there is no sense of self or knowing, with a sense of self. That's not there. Even in the up until very recently, in 2007 or so, that even people in coma or little kind of less severe form of such unconscious state, known as persistent vegetative state, they were believed to be unconscious as well, having no consciousness. But that has changed as some British and Belgian scientists, when they subjected these people to test by asking them to imagine or to giving them some names, then the certain brain circuits that are associated with sound, the words, they lit up. When they were asked to imagine playing tennis, there are certain motor kind of the neural circuits lit up. Even when they were asked about their name, that apparently and I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't have a very specific kind of name for this circuit, but there is apparently a certain area that part lit up whenever you think of your name or yourself, and then it's lit up. So it's what it should, it challenges the kind of prevailing idea that consciousness. To have consciousness, you need to be awake, in the conventional sense. That is, so when you see this kind of changes, it in a way, kind of demands the scientific community to step back and then visit how we understand consciousness. If those persistent vegetative states people are able to create very specific brain images, almost no different than the people in the wakeful state, then how do we draw that who has consciousness and who has not? So these are some of the ideas. I think that in terms of investigating, as we engage in developing better understanding about these inner states, methodology is very important. Which methods that we apply so far in examining any kind of the scientific object that one investigates. Mostly they have been external. Certainly the mind, the emotions, and the consciousness in the recent years have become the kind of object of scientific inquiry, certainly. But the approach has remained largely the sort of the conventional also. That is the third person approach. That the science, to do science, it must be kind of measurable in the third person sense. It must be repeatable, reproducible, and so forth. But there is a serious problem with that kind of approach when it comes to investigating the very inner states of the mind that are experiential. This third person approach, even though through indirect ways we can find very many correlations through brain imaging and the other behavioral kind of the changes and so forth and so on. But ultimately, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama points out in his book on this universe in the single atom, he has really very compelling kind of argument to utilize the first person approach also to investigating these inner states of the mind. And that's where the contemplative traditions become so handy, so helpful, because contemplative tradition like the ancient traditions upheld by these great masters, like the Nalanda masters, as Ishalnas would say, and kept alive in Tibet for so many centuries. And it is a living tradition that, where you can find that very advanced meditators, what they call the adept meditators. Here is an opportunity for the scientists to actually combine this first person and third person approaches to investigating some of these inner mental states. Now that's precisely what has been happening, like in the Richard Davidson's lab in Wisconsin, that they brought these adept meditators, and in one of the very initial studies to examine the very specific mental states, like just attention, for example, compassion, something they call the open space and so forth, and devotion and so forth, to see if a subject, if a person, subjectively or deliberately can generate certain states. And then that can be measured through the third person approach, through these brain imaging scanners. And if it is done repeatedly, then you can say that the subjective experience of the meditator is valid. Otherwise, the introspectionism, there's the way or reason that they failed is that the introspectionism was considered somewhat unreliable way to learn about what's going on inside, because each individual had different version of kind of accounts. But if something can be done reliably, which Matthew Ricard, a French Buddhist monk, I'm sure that all of you know, that he was subjected to this test for 11 times with 1-minute intervals to do one thing first, to focus, create this attention part, the mindfulness or attention part, and relax, and then do again and relax for a minute, and again. And when you see the kind of chart, the chart that produced, it's like the high rise, like the shoreline in New York City with the high rises and the gaps and the high rises, so precisely matching that 1 minute when he was developing the attention and so forth, and then that correlated with other kind of the mental states, whether it's devotion or compassion and so forth. So that's this kind of collaborative work and the evidence. It gives a tremendous kind of hope and source of optimism for us to in the future to develop better understanding about these mental states. Now, with regard to what these changes that we can bring in our mental or the emotional inner states mean in terms of our health and well-being and the social kind of the well-being. Just to give you one example, because there are hundreds of studies now conducted on meditation, like the mindfulness and its impact on depression or the changes in well, even with the psoriasis, some kind of stress-related skin disease, that in the speed of recovery for such illnesses and so forth. There are hundreds of studies. But yesterday, we were one of the topics that was raised was that about this mental or the mind scope. That it need to understand, not just to kind of to look for in the extraterrestrial realm for life and what there might be, but we live in this globe, together as neighbors, as co-workers, and every day together. And this is where that if we are out of tune with each other, if we are not able to pick up each other's kind of mental state and so forth, we will not be interacting in meaningful, healthy way that would promote harmony and benefits and so forth. So, is there a way? Is there even a foundation? Is there a way that the contemplative practices can enable us to become better fine-tuned with the inner experiences of others? And the good thing again here is that the science and contemplative traditions have come together in beautiful ways at this point where there is actually this converging kind of the understanding from both traditions. From the neuroscientific perspective, the understanding about these mirror neurons that organisms have, particularly humans, with quite rich stock of mirror neurons, which apparently enable us to get into others' mind and body. I mean, that's whether it's not necessarily happening consciously, but you basically pick up others' sadness and the different emotional states unconsciously, in often time. But can we get better in understanding such? And this is what the hypothesis, I've got the thesis of Daniel Goleman's book, Social Intelligence. It has to do with in the social world that we live in. Social intelligence is so important for us to function properly in the social world, and the meditation helps become better fine-tuned in kind of picking up others' emotional states. In other words, it helps with your empathy accuracy. And one of the studies we have done at Emory University, actually, in collaboration with your university, Chris, in Arizona, and in this particular, the particular test that I'm going to say, and then I need to stop here, has to do with what is known as the reading the mind in the eyes. Reading the mind in the eyes, and that this is a test that having people just read the eyes, from the eyes, the emotional states. They're just showing the eyes part. And to see that how accurately they can pick up whether they are sad, happy, angry, and so forth. The idea is that the better you pick up, the better you will be, your empathy kind of the level is. And in this study that we have done with a meditation study called compassion meditation, cognitively based compassion meditation training. After 8 weeks of meditation, these the meditators, when compared to the control group, they were much better in their accuracy was much higher than compared to the control. And it correlated with the brain imaging also, because they were also at put through the imaging, and then there are certain parts of the brain, like the inferior frontal gyrus. I think that is the part of the brain that is rich with mirror neurons. There that you see that the meditators have greater brain function in that part of the brain, and there are actually three parts. So this kind of collaborations and very kind of the promising and for us to have these dialogues together, and it's really extraordinary kind of vision of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to have had this kind of like 30 years ago, to where ahead of his time, that everyone's time, to anticipate that this kind of collaboration will bear this kind of fruits. It's really amazing, and I'm personally just very kind of indebted to have the association with the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives under Geshe Ladola's leadership to work on kind of a project which His Holiness the Dalai Lama has envisioned, or to promote this kind of understanding where contemplatives and the scientists can come together and collaborate in exploring these inner kind of resources that we are just barely kind of scratching the surface at this point. And it's a program for educating the venerable monks and nuns in the modern sciences, in the hope not for just to make them scientists, but to really to be able to tap into their knowledge of the inner world of mind and emotions, so that the whole world can benefit and be a better place. Thank you very much.